Today we're going to be talking about endocrine disorders. We'll start with a minor review, endocrine physiology, mechanisms of hypothalamic pituitary regulation. Again, the review for endocrine content was on your preparation questions, so you're supposed to have done those preparation questions before coming in. You should remember all of the glands and all of the things that they secrete and all of the roles that those have. Then we'll get into disorders of endocrine function, and there's going to be a pattern there. When the endocrine system goes wrong, there's actually 4 places where that endocrine system can go wrong. Usually we have a primary disease and a secondary disease, right? And those are kind of our options. Primary disease, the thing itself is diseased. Secondary disease, meaning something else is diseased, and that's causing the problems for this other system. Now, in endocrine disorders, what we're going to have is primary, secondary, tertiary, and tissue resistance. There's actually going to be 4 possible layers where things go wrong, and sometimes the naming conventions get a little wonky because of all of these different places. Any hormonal cascade can go wrong. We will spend a specific amount of time on diabetes mellitus, and then we will be cramming in some information about alterations in metabolism and nutrition, how things like injury, infection, inflammation, long-term are going to impact your metabolism of different nutrients and your dietary requirements. I know that's going to have some overlap with other classes that you've had. Okay, so a slight review, just to say that remember that hormones are going to be reliant on receptors for that hormone being located on target cells. When a hormone is secreted, it's secreted into the bloodstream, and then the bloodstream carries it around everywhere. And the cells that are affected are the ones with receptors for that thing. So there's going to be 2 different concepts. I want you to write 2 different concepts while you're taking notes on this. There's a direct effect. If you have more of a hormone, at least for a little while, you're going to have more of a reaction. If you have less of a hormone, overall, you're going to have less of a reaction. That's the direct. That's the short term. So while you're thinking about hypersecretion disorders of too much hormone, you should think of an increased response to that hormone. And if you're talking about a hyposecretion disorder, a disorder where you have less of a hormone, you should be thinking of your body having less of a response to that hormone. It's very direct and very literal. What's on this slide is actually kind of the opposite of that idea. Now, just the fact that it's opposite doesn't mean it's wrong. The idea is that your body is going to try to compensate. If you have elevated hormones, if you have too low hormones, your body can compensate by upregulation or downregulation of receptors. It's a homeostatic mechanism. So, for example, if you have low hormone levels long term, your cells may start to express more receptors for that hormone. Maybe it's enough to compensate for a little while, maybe not. Right? So the disorder is still going to be low hormone, low response, but your body's trying to compensate by adding more receptors and having a higher expression of receptors for that hormone. And that's called upregulation. Now, if you had elevated hormone levels, if you have a hypersecretion disorder, then your body may compensate, your cells may compensate by downregulating receptors. So downregulation of receptors would occur in response to elevated hormone levels. That has a lot of implications, and it has implications not only for health and compensatory mechanisms, but also for pharmacology. Because a lot of pharmacology is, let's do a replacement hormone, let's do a replacement neurotransmitter. And if you have elevated levels of that thing all of a sudden, your body may downregulate receptors for that thing. Whether it's natural or artificial, our body's endogenous response to that is going to be downregulation. Does that make sense? Why that's significant? Yes? Yeah, remember that the response at the cellular level is based on the existence of the receptor. So if we take away the receptors, then yes, you're correct. We won't be able to have the cellular response to that overabundant hormone, neurotransmitter, whatever it is. Today it's hormones. You and then you, yes. Yeah, for hypothyroidism, so the receptors for that would be thyroid hormone receptors. And if you had hypothyroidism, you may upregulate the receptors for thyroid hormone as an attempt to compensate for that. This would work for any cascade. There may be some variation between the degree that this happens, by body region, by some other concepts that I don't know about, but this is a general rule for how your body's going to compensate. Is that? So the statement upregulation and downregulation refers to the receptor. We may actually change our production of that hormone endogenously as well. So I can give the example of melatonin because that's my field. If you're going to Whole Foods and you're getting 5 milligrams of melatonin, your body may stop endogenous production of melatonin in response to that, as well as downregulation of receptors for melatonin. Absolutely, yeah. That's a perfect example. It's taking certain street drugs that affect serotonergic pathways. They can absolutely have long-term ramifications for serotonergic pathways. Absolutely. And that's precisely the relevance of this, is drugs can mess up your receptors and the production of that substance as well. Question? There should be a degree of adjustment. In the case of certain street drugs, like I think she used the phrase, that one's permanent, yeah. That can be permanent brain damage. That's brain damage. Their brain is non-mitotic. Those neurons, at least, are non-mitotic in most brain regions. So that is a form of brain damage in that case. But for things like melatonin, you can usually readjust. Yeah, and you can always look into, it's going to be a case-by-case basis for whether something is causing permanent brain damage or if it's something that your homeostasis can return back to your set point. Is that making sense? You guys asked great questions about it, so thank you for that. You found the relevance really quickly, which I appreciate. Yeah, go for it. Exactly. It's kind of desperation, right? Like, when we can increase the hormone for some reason, let's increase our response to it, the hormone that exists, as much as we possibly can, right? I mean, there's actually a lot of medicine and treatments that rely on that concept, right? Like when we give somebody with myasthenia gravis acetylcholine or cholinergic drugs, that's right? I didn't mix that. When you give them cholinergic drugs, the receptors are still messed up. We're just flooding them with acetylcholine, hoping that those few receptors that still work are going to respond to them. It's that same principle of, if we can't get the receptor back, let's change the substance. If we can't change the substance, let's change the receptor. Hormones in the blood, remember, they are circulating. They will be prone to being filtered by organs of filtration. Your kidneys are going to pee out a certain amount of drugs. Your liver is going to break down certain drugs. And you also have circulating enzymes that will break down hormones, rather. Substances is what I should be saying, hormones. And that's important, right? We don't want a hormone that we release to circulate forever. It would be bad if you went into fight or flight this morning, let's say half an hour ago, and you were still in fight or flight right now, right? You need to be able to destroy that hormone circulating so that you can go on to your next state physiologically. So the time that it takes to remove or degrade a hormone, that's going to be called its half-life. Have you covered this in Pharm? Yeah, you've covered this in Pharm, so you know what's up there. I won't spend more time on it. I will point out our monoamine oxidase enzyme. It ends in ACE. It's an enzyme by definition. That's going to help us break down. That's a specific enzyme that helps us break down a number of hormones, such as epinephrine and norepinephrine. Hormones also interact with each other, and they can interact in a number of ways. They can act permissively. It could be that you already have a circulating hormone and it may not act until another hormone is present. That would be permissiveness. It can act antagonistically. One hormone may act in the opposite fashion to another. And the one that's being illustrated on this graph right here is synergism. It sounds like a business buzzword because businesses co-opted the buzzword. It means that for each of these individual hormones, there is an effect, But when you combine these hormones, the new effect is several times higher. It's a synergistic effect. It's not a direct additive effect. It's not 2 plus 2 plus 3 equals 7, right? It's 2 plus 2 plus 3 equals, whoa, 50, right? It's synergistic, so it's many times more effective when multiple hormones are present that have the same effect. Did that make sense? Okay. Do you like that math equation? I just came up with it. Good. Yeah, I just made that up on the spot, so I feel pretty good about that. So, and then a reminder about, first of all, cascades and then negative feedback loops. We did already talk about receptor up and down regulation. We did hint that, okay, in overabundant hormone, we're going to decrease production. So this is just a reminder of the pathways that lead to decreased production in a cascade. So there's multiple levels, and this is what I was telling you about primary, secondary, tertiary, tissue resistant. These are some of the levels that you can see that can become damaged and cause an endocrine disorder as well. This slide's giving you a lot of information. So the cascade that leads to the release of thyroid hormones. For example, you're going to start with the hypothalamus releasing thyroid releasing hormone. The target of that is the anterior pituitary gland. The cells of the anterior pituitary gland are going to have receptors for thyroid releasing hormone. In response to thyroid releasing hormone, these cells are going to release thyroid stimulating hormone. Thyroid stimulating hormone has target cells of the thyroid gland, and in response, the thyroid gland releases thyroid hormone. Here it's annotated TH. You may see T3 or T4 as the annotation in other resources. Now, when you have elevated thyroid hormones, homeostasis dictates that we're going to send negative feedback loops to both the anterior pituitary and the hypothalamus. Right? So this is what we were saying before. If you take a bunch of melatonin, you may stop producing endogenous melatonin. You'll have receptors for that elevated level, and then that gland will down-regulate the production of that hormone. Yes? Not that I can think of. The question was, is there any hormone in the body that doesn't work on a negative feedback loop? And as far as I can tell, the answer to that is no. Maybe with the exception of norepinephrine, but I think that's just going to be a positive feedback loop for fight or flight until it ceases. There's probably still a way to downregulate it. Yes? Well, that's what we were talking about earlier. Can your body return to homeostasis after a long period of abuse? And we said it's system dependent. So if it was something like a street drug, some of those, there's evidence that that's a permanent change in the brain. But for melatonin, there's no evidence of permanent damage. It is variant, yes. And the mechanism of action is going to have an impact on that. The dosing is going to have an impact. Obviously, the street drug is abusing your serotonergic system. You're secreting a lot of serotonin. Whereas your lethal dose of melatonin is obscenely high. I've never heard of a lethal dose for melatonin. You can pretty much take as much as you want. Again, you'll downregulate, but and I've looked into it. I'm an expert on melatonin, so yes. Potentially, yes. Absolutely, yes. Yeah, you can give yourself chronic lifelong depression by abusing your serotonergic systems with street drugs. That has happened. You have a question, I think. Cigarette smoking and nicotine, yeah. Probably. Well, we have nicotinic receptors, so you have some endogenous production of something that attaches to the nicotinic receptors. Does anybody remember what attaches to nicotinic receptors? Well, nicotine, the drug, also attaches to them. What's your endogenous product? Not epinephrine, those are adrenergic receptors, alpha and beta. It's a pathway you learned in A and P1. That's muscarinic, and you're on the right track. You're on the exact correct place on the worksheet. You did this on the worksheet too. It's true. I'm glad you looked at the worksheet to prepare for this. That's a good thing. Sympathetic or parasympathetic? Actually, it's both of them, but is it preganglionic or postganglionic? Nope. Preganglionic. Blank onto nicotinic receptors. I think I gave you the worksheet for it, though, to fill out in AMP2, because it's an important worksheet. I'm just going to keep waiting. I can't tell you. It's a really common one. You're going to slap your head when you hear it. Acetylcholine. Acetylcholine onto nicotinic. And then acetylcholine onto muscarinic for postganglionic in the parasympathetic division. And then does anybody remember the sympathetic postganglionic? You actually got pretty close to this one too. What's the fight or flight neuron or neurotransmitter? Norepinephrine. Onto what? We just said it a minute ago too. Not muscarinic, that's parasympathetic. No, we already did nicotinic. Epinephrine onto what type of receptor? You've learned a ton of these in pharm at this point. What kind of receptors? You should have, damn it. Oh well. Alpha beta adrenergic receptors. That's the one we said a minute ago. If you want, I can give you that worksheet from AMP1 again. If you didn't have me for AMP1, it's good to fill out the cool worksheet that I made for that and have it forever and ever. I know for a fact you're going to be asked about this information from the autonomic nervous system in quarter 11. It keeps coming up. This stuff keeps coming up. I hear people talk about it all the time for the later semester content. Just carry around all the worksheets I give you permanently. When you're 50, you should still have them immediately on hand. You should walk into the patient's room 16 years from now and be like, yes, muscarinic receptors. I know about those. Yeah. That's going to be what's wrong with somebody one day. Yes. Somebody's going to eat mushrooms. They're going to be dying. And you're going to be like, oh, muscarine. That's how that's going to work.
The mushroom one.
It's the mushroom one. Let me show you guys, if you didn't have AMP1 with me, let me share my screen really quick. Screen. Let me show you Amanita Muscaria. This is a mushroom that produces muscarine, and people eat it. And it's the parasympathetic division. It's going to attach to your muscarinic receptors. And it's going to slow down your heart rate and slow down your breathing artificially, and you could end up in a coma and you can die. So don't eat a mushroom that looks like that. Mario was all wrong. It is really cute. I actually have a print of this in my kitchen. And I have this. This is a stretchy mushroom. Okay, moving on back. Okay, we got off a little off track. So this was just showing, I think where we were on this was to say that elevated thyroid hormones are going to be in a negative feedback loop. It's not giving me my cursor. Let me fix my cursor problem real quick. My apologies to people listening to this recording repeatedly for the time delay. All right, you don't get a cursor apparently. The recording gets a cursor, so I'll use a laser pointer as well. So what we're going to see is that elevated thyroid hormones are going to act in a negative feedback loop to the anterior pituitary. So elevated thyroid hormones is going to lead to less production of thyroid stimulating hormone. It's also going to lead to less production of thyroid releasing hormone from the hypothalamus. Therefore, let's say somebody has hyperthyroidism and they've got elevated thyroid hormone. What are their TRH levels going to be? Low. They're going to decrease their TRH and TSH levels in response to that.
Is it inverse proportionate? So if the thyroid levels are high, then the TRH will be low.
Correct. It'll be an inverse relationship because it's homeostatic. So if TH is high, therefore TSH and TRH will be low. Now what we're going to see with our hypersecretion disorders is that's usually not going to stop the gland for overproducing. There's going to be some other reason it's overproducing, usually like a secreting tumor is what we're going to see the most of. Now the other way around, thyroid hormone levels are low, you have hypothyroidism. What are your TRH levels going to look like? What are your TSH levels going to look like? They're going to be elevated. So that's a lab value you're going to get back one day. Somebody's going to have elevated TSH, and you're still going to be telling them that they have hypothyroidism. And maybe they're thinking about it and thinking, why would high TSH mean I'm hypothyroid, right? And you're going to have to explain that to them. It's because it's in a negative feedback loop.
And if TSH is low, then TRH is high.
Not necessarily. So remember, this is a cascade, so TRH presumably would be low first, therefore TSH presumably would be low as a result of that, if I said that the right way. I'm not seeing a specific feedback loop where TSH would also act in a negative feedback loop for TRH. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Just
hyperthyroidism, TSH is high, TRH is low. Right? I'm just making sure my notes right. Is that wrong?
so let's say you had a pituitary secreting tumor. This is going to get us to our secondary endocrine disorder. This helps me segue into my next bit anyway, so I'll just go with it. So let's say the problem's not with your thyroid gland. The problem now is with your pituitary gland. Let's say you've got a secreting tumor of the pituitary and it's releasing too much TSH. So now the thyroid hormone is doing what? Is it releasing more TH or less TH? So more TSH, direct effect of that is going to be more TH, more thyroid hormone. That's the direct effect, right? Maybe long-term we'll have downregulation, but in what we should generally assume for a hypersecretion disorder is higher response. That compensatory mechanism of downregulation is probably not enough. So TSH is high, therefore TH is high, but look at this negative feedback loop. What's TRH going to do? That's going to be low. Yes, exactly. Say that loud for the recording. Just
Okay,
like
so like our normal feedback loops, our any product is high, all the previous products are low because it blocks the.
Exactly. So if end product is high, all previous products are low. Is a good way to say that. Now let's say it's not your thyroid gland that's a problem. It's not your pituitary that's the problem. Now you've got a secreting tumor of the hypothalamus. And it's releasing overabundant TRH. So TRH is high, what's going to happen to TSH? High, what's going to happen to thyroid hormone? High. More hormone, more response. More hormone, more response.
Right.
So the whole cascade will be high.
Wait, so now I'm a little bit. If TRH is high, then TSH will be high. But how come when we were talking before, when you said TSH is high and TH is high, but then TRH would be low?
Because that's the only reason that TRH would be low is because this negative feedback loop. But in this case, we've got a secreting tumor of the hypothalamus, so it's not paying attention to thyroid hormone levels. It does not care. Good. All right, so that gives us, this would be the primary disorder if the thyroid hormone is messed up. This gives us our secondary disorder if the pituitary gland is messed up. This gives us our tertiary disorder now. because the hypothalamus is in control of most of these hormonal cascades. When we say tertiary endocrine disorder, we pretty much mean hypothalamus. Now, not all of our endocrine cascades are going to that hypothalamus, but most of them are, yes. If the disease expressed itself as hyperthyroidism or hypothyroidism, but the problem is up here, then it's tertiary. It's the number of steps away.
It originated there.
Even though it originated in the hypothalamus, the problem that is expressing in this case is a thyroid manifestation. So if there were other problems, if the problem of the hypothalamus was, let's say, deregulation of appetite for food or water, that would be a different condition, and then you would say it's a hypothalamus disorder, and that would be primary to the hypothalamus. It's expressing as a disease of the hypothalamus. But the condition we're talking about is a disorder of thyroid hormones, where it's manifesting as hypothyroidism, hyperthyroidism, whichever one, but the problem is way back here in the hypothalamus. Does that make sense? Yeah, Philip.
I have to show you what I wrote down because I need simple words.
That's okay. In hyperthyroidism, if TSH is high, thyroid hormone is high, TRH is low, that would be in a secondary condition, specifically of the anterior pituitary.
Beautiful.
Correct, because it's going to try to compensate. There, you're fine.
Beautiful.
It is confusing. That's why we're walking through it. And I think it might be on the worksheet. If not, there's a new version of it on the worksheet. I used to have a whole table with a bunch of arrows pointing up, pointing down. I'll see if I still have it. Don't worry, you'll get to work this out with arrows. So many arrows. The goal here is understanding it, right? Do we want me to keep working on this and maybe run through it one more time as a cascade before moving on? Okay. So let's start from the top. Let's start from the hypothalamus. A hypothalamic disorder. Let's say it's not releasing TRH. Let's say you had brain damage, your hypothalamus, just a segment of it is broken, and you're not releasing TRH. So TRH is low. Is the anterior pituitary going to release TSH? No, so TSH will be low. Is your thyroid gland going to release thyroid hormone? No, all three would be low. That would be a hypothalamus disorder manifesting as hypothyroidism. One, two, three. Tertiary disorder. Yes. It depends on what is disordered. Hypothyroidism can be because of the thyroid gland, which would be primary. Hypothyroidism can be because of the pituitary. Secondary. Hypothyroidism can be because of the hypothalamus. Then it would be tertiary. Yep. Okay, let's say now you've got a pituitary hyposecretion disorder, and you're not releasing TSH. TSH would be low, therefore thyroid hormone would be. Therefore, would this feedback loop exist?
No.
No. So would the hypothalamus keep releasing TRH? Yes.
Oh, because it's unrelated.
If there's no feedback loop.
I'm sorry, I want to clarify. You said for the pituitary disorder, TSH is low,
Yep.
TH is
Also low.
low, and then TRH would still be secreted, so it'd
High.
be high.
It'd be high.
For hypothyroidism.
Yeah, I have it right
Pituitary
here.
disorder.
For a pituitary disorder resulting in hypothyroidism, TSH would be low, therefore TH would be low. Therefore, there would be an absence of feedback loop.
Right.
Therefore, TRH would be high. That would be secondary. Now let's go do one more for the thyroid gland, hypothyroidism because of a thyroid condition. Primary, secondary, tertiary. Primary. So thyroid hormone is low. No negative feedback loop. TRH would be high. TSH would be high. There you go. Getting it? Getting it?
So that, the feedback is
Mhm.
So the orange, is that just like existent or non-existent, or can it be like a low level of it, or?
So it's going to depend on the thyroid hormone levels.
Okay.
If thyroid hormone levels are elevated, then that's going to be the signal that says, no, we need to produce less of these trophic hormones. Do you guys remember the word of trophic or tropic or releasing hormones? What's the definition of trophic, and releasing hormones? Kind of. We'll rephrase it. What's a trophic hormone or a releasing hormone? It's signaling another gland to release another hormone. That's a trophic hormone. So it's not like the end product. It's not thyroid hormone that's going to the cells and doing the things.
Right.
It's going to another gland and saying, now you release your gland, your cell, or your hormone. Domino effect, absolutely. Okay. So again, elevated thyroid hormone, that's going to be what's detected by the hypothalamus and pituitary, and that's going to be a negative feedback loop that says stop releasing it. And it's going to be by degrees. So if there's a whole bunch of it, that's a stronger negative feedback loop than if it's only slightly elevated. Yeah, it's more like a fade than an on-off switch, definitely. Yep. You can have, these are all by degrees. All of these endocrine disorders are by degrees. In fact, almost every disease is by degrees, in all honesty. So case in point, my partner has mild hyperthyroidism. At one point, he was diagnosed with Graves' disease, but his thyroid hormone levels were only ever slightly elevated. And so he's just got like a really mild form of the disease. He doesn't need to be on medication. He just needs to eat a lot of carbs, and he stays skinny.
That's nice.
I know.
That doesn't sound like
It doesn't. It's not fair. Okay, questions about that? Are you feeling better now that we've gone through it an extra time or two?
Yes.
Okay, good. Your tables have some things backwards. I did check. This is true for the new edition as well, unfortunately. Some of your hyposecretion and hypersecretion disorders are simply backwards in these tables, which is kind of ridiculous to get wrong, because literally it's in the name. If it's hyposecretion, it's going to be hypoparathyroidism. Same thing here. This is backwards as well. Should gesture on here. These are backwards. These are backwards. They've just mixed up hyper and hyposecretion disorders. If it's a hyposecretion disorder, it's going to have hypo in the name. If it's a hypersecretion disorder, it's going to have hyper in the name. It's pretty obvious. I don't know how they got that backwards. So, that having been said, so thyroid hormone, when you have a hyposecretion disorder of that, it's going to be called hypothyroidism. Very straightforward. No, it goes with goiter. They messed up the whole, they just switched everything in that row. Yep. If you have a hypersecretion of thyroid hormone, you're going to have hyperthyroidism, which is in many cases known as Graves' disease. There are other forms of hyperthyroidism aside from Graves' disease. Likewise with parathyroid hormone, if you have a hyposecretion disorder of parathyroid hormone, then you have hypoparathyroidism. And if you have a hypersecretion disorder of parathyroid hormone, you have hyperparathyroidism. And what's that going to do? Now, we spent a lot of time on calcium homeostasis over the courses of A&P 1 and 2. So you should remember calcium homeostasis and the hormones that control it. What hormone deposits calcium into bone? Calcitonin. And what hormone withdraws calcium from bone into the bloodstream? Parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone also has two other actions. So the first one is the one we covered, is that parathyroid hormone leads to reabsorption of calcium from the bones. It stimulates osteoclasts. Osteoclasts secrete acid onto the inorganic components of bone and release calcium into the bloodstream, elevating blood calcium. But there's two other mechanisms to elevate blood calcium. We will reabsorb more calcium from the kidneys, so we'll pee out less calcium. PTH also does this. PTH also causes reabsorption of calcium from the tubules of the kidneys, thereby, again, elevating blood calcium. And in the intestines, it causes increased absorption of calcium across the intestinal tract. Yes. PTH has target cells in the bones, kidneys, and GI tract.
I feel like this was covered in A.
It totally was covered in AMP2.
I was like, this sounds familiar.
It's a big chunk. I agree. I started this in AMP1. And it's because we're working up to this concept of hyperparathyroidism is going to cause what? Highly increased blood calcium, which is going to have a number of effects. For example, what do we call elevated blood calcium? Hypercalcemia. Yeah. Another thing it can do is that calcium can deposit into random joint spaces or in random places in the body like blood vessel walls. You can calcify in uncomfortable and inappropriate places as a result of that. What about hypoparathyroidism? Hypocalcemia. And what do we need calcium for? Why? Muscle contraction, neurons firing, all kinds of things. Osteoporosis long term, yeah. More prone to bone fracture long term. Yeah. Yeah, twitching, cramping for hypocalcemia. Yeah, absolutely. And that's the way this is going to play out all day. We'll talk about a hormone, what happens when it's elevated, what happens when it's low, what caused it to be elevated, what caused it to be low. And was it part of a cascade? Was it the hormone itself or the gland itself? Or was it the pituitary or the gland? There's actually one more place where this can mess up, aside from that cascade, and that's tissue resistance. We require a receptor for this to work. So if you have no receptor, the receptors are broken. Maybe it's a genetic disorder. Maybe it's an autoimmune response to the receptor, like myasthenia gravis, destroying acetylcholine receptors. That's called tissue resistance. Yeah, tissue resistance means the receptors are not working for some reason. And we'll go into what those reasons are. So that was a nice overview. It's a good time to go on a break. I'm going to pause now.